The Wild West. You know today, with gunfights, duels, and the dusty cowboys, was a lie built by Hollywood. The real frontier was stranger, tamer, and far more human than you might have even imagined, with twists that you would never expect. Let's ride through 25 of the dumbest Wild West myths that never happened, but we all believe are true. Subscribe to the channel if you're looking for more Wild West facts. Everyone wore cowboy hats. The first thing that comes to your mind when you think about a cowboy is the cowboy hat. This might be the biggest fashion lie in American history. Why? Well, before Stetson popularized it in the 1860s, most people in the West wore bowler hats, flat caps, or even military surplus caps. The Stetson's boss of the Pains hat only caught its popularity after the Civil War. Even if you look at old photos from Dodge City or Deadwood, you see bankers and even sheriffs wearing derby hats, looking more like gentlemen than outlaws. Real cowboys were looking for practicality, not something that would fly off while riding horses or get snagged in the fence. In short, if you think everyone in the West looks like Clint Eastwood, you'd be very wrong. Daily gunfights. Next, you have to forget the image of the Wild West if it were chaotic every single day. Everyone gets the image of men stepping into the street at high noon with dust swirling and hands twitching near their holsters. But what about the average number of actual document duels in a frontier town? Realistically, that number would actually be one every few years. More people of the Wild West settled disputes with words, fists, or courts and not with bullets. In many towns like Tombstone, Deadwood, or Dodge City, visitors would need to check their guns with the sheriff when entering. The Wild West had stricter gun control laws than the America we know today. And the famous OK Corral shootout? That lasted only 30 seconds, but Hollywood made a whole movie on it, of course. The Wild West was lawless. The no law, no order myth sells movies, but reality was quite different. Most frontier towns had sheriffs, courts, mayors, and evil local newspapers that kept people accountable. In fact, the frontier crime rates back in the days were lower than those of many big eastern cities of today, like New York or Philadelphia. That's because the times of the past were tough, and they wanted more investors, families, and railroads. Even famous outlaws like Jesse James operated more like publicity-hungry rebels than serial killers. The real danger in the Wild West was actually disease, famine, and sometimes nature itself. All cowboys were white. The truth is that cowboys came in all colors, shapes, and sizes. About 1 in 4 were black. Many freed slaves who found new lives after the Civil War became cowboys. A big chunk of cowboys were also the Mexican vaqueros, whose culture inspired the cowboy culture with unique tools, clothing, and techniques of battles. Native Americans also worked on ranches and led cattle drives. But the Western films erased this reality, turning the cowboy into a symbol of white, rugged masculinity. However, that was never the case. Everyone carried a six-shooter. The classic six-shooter was quite expensive, and most settlers couldn't even afford one. A Colt revolver of that time would nearly cost a month's wages. Instead, people carried hunting rifles, shotguns, or knives. Many also relied on tools for self-defense, like pitchforks or axes, as they worked just fine for close-range combat. Moreover, ammunition was costly at that time, so people didn't practice shooting cans all day, as bullets were saved for hunting or emergencies. The gun culture we know today did not exist then. Saloon fights happened all the time. Nope. Saloons weren't chaos zones, and were regular community centers where miners, travelers, and townsfolk met to relax. Liquor was chugged down, and bartenders were armed. Starting a fight most of the time would get you banned or beaten, or sometimes even killed. Most entertainment came from music, gambling, or storytelling. But what about the famous bottle-breaking bar fight scene? That's purely a Hollywood stunt. In real life, even glass was too costly to waste. But of course, some bar fights and even shootouts did happen, just not as frequently as you think they were. Whiskey was like water. When we listen to different songs or watch movies, we always see some cowboy being drunk out mad, practically downing whiskey. But real whiskey was rare and expensive. Most whiskey sold in saloons was cheap home-brewed alcohol, mixed with kerosene, tobacco juice, or molasses to mimic the color and burn. People would either drink it for courage or comfort, but the cost-cutting made them sick. It wasn't till the railroads expanded that real whiskey came from the East, giving frontier drinkers their first taste of actual quality spirits. There were outlaws everywhere. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, and probably hundreds of other names. We tend to focus on these outlaws a lot whenever the topic of the Wild West comes up. The truth? Well, outlaws were the minority, and these figures got famous because they were rare and newspapers often exaggerated their stories. Most Westerners were ranchers, shopkeepers, or miners who just wanted to survive. But when someone did turn outlaw, it often came from desperation, including failed crops, hunger, injustice, or pure greed or evil. Even Jesse James's crimes were blown up into folklore by journalists who loved drama more than the actual truth, which is kind of sad. Native Americans always attacked settlers. The news and the old stories paint us this picture that most tribes were always causing issues for the settlers. However, that is all wrong. Most tribes preferred peace and trade, with some of them trading food, furs, and horses with settlers. Violence usually erupted after some treaties were broken or land was stolen. In fact, many settlers lived among the native tribes for years, but novels painted native tribes as bloodthirsty savages to sell copies by fueling decades of fake history and fiction. The real tragedy wasn't the attacks, but how many tribes were displaced or destroyed in the name of expansion. Young people dying everywhere. By now, it is true and given that life in the Old West was tough. But you'll be shocked to know that most of those people lived well into their 60s and even beyond. The myth of short life expectancy comes from infant mortality, not adult deaths. If you survived childhood, you would likely live a life full of health. Moreover, doctors were scarce, but herbal medicine, fresh food, and manual labor kept many people surprisingly healthy. The real killers were disease outbreaks like cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis, not gunfights. The gold rush made everyone wealthy. Many dreamers came to California hoping for instant riches when the gold rush began, but almost none of them found anything. Less than 1% struck gold, and most miners spent years digging dirt just to be demotivated and left with nothing. But those who truly got rich were the merchants. For example, Levi Strauss sold jeans to miners, and Samuel Brannan sold them shovels and pans. The gold rush was less a treasure hunt and more a giant business opportunity for the suppliers. The frontier was empty. The West was not an empty land anyone could come and claim. Rather, millions of American natives lived there with advanced civilizations like the Pueblo and Mexican settlers. The phrase "manifest destiny" justified taking those lands by force. But according to various archaeological records, it shows bustling trade routes, farms, and architecture long before the white settlers even arrived. Calling it empty was a political lie to make conquest sound noble. Women were oppressed and silent. Another huge myth that makes the world uselessly angry is that the women on the frontier were helpless. However, that's not true. They were actually strong, independent, and vital for survival. They ran businesses, farms, and even entire towns. We already know this from women like Calamity Jane, who became legends for defying gender roles. Many other women also worked as teachers, midwives, or travelers. By the late 1800s, states like Wyoming granted women voting rights decades before the rest of the U.S. There were wanted posters everywhere. The wanted posters in the Wild West were rarely printed and mostly inaccurate. Many towns didn't have presses, and illiteracy was common. Lawmen usually relied on telegrams or word of mouth to spread the news, and even the sketches on the posters were exaggerated, and criminals didn't have glamorous photos like the ones seen in most Hollywood movies. Horses were common. Looking at most Wild West movies, we see that almost everyone has a horse, but the truth is far from that. Many settlers walked or used wagons pulled by oxen. Horses required feed, shoes, and care, which was something that wasn't possible for everyone from that era. To put things into perspective, a stolen horse could bankrupt a man, which is why horse theft was a hanging offense in many territories. Cowboys used them for daily work, but for farmers, horses just couldn't justify the cost. Bank robberies were common. It seems like everyone tends to think that bank robberies were common back in the days, especially when we see a lot of Wild West legends and their stories. However, that's not true at all. Between 1859 and 1900, historians found fewer than 10 recorded bank robberies in the entire frontier. Armed locals protected banks, and outlaws were usually looking for easier targets like stagecoaches and trains. Tombstone was a hellhole. When we think about Tombstone of the past, we think that it's a lawless hellhole with nothing but fights happening every single day. You see, despite its reputation, Tombstone was a wealthy silver mining town with schools, churches, and even a theater. The OK Corral gunfight that defined Tombstone as lawless only lasted half a minute and killed only 3 men. For most residents, Tombstone was business and not bullets. Cowboys versus Indians. Another big myth is that cowboys and natives were always fighting, but that's not true. In reality, they were largely working together. Many cattle driving techniques that cowboys had came directly from native culture, and tribes often traded horses, guided settlers through terrain, and sometimes even guarded herds. Everyone lived in shacks. Do you really believe everyone lived in log cabins? Well, only some settlers started with them. But as towns grew, buildings grew thick, and hotels and theaters also appeared quickly. Cities like Denver, Santa Fe, and San Francisco had electric lights and cable cars before most of the eastern towns. Moreover, boom towns could transform overnight from tents to full cities. The image of everyone huddling in a wooden shack is completely wrong. Everyone spoke like a cowboy. Another big issue with the Western image of the Wild West is that everyone spoke the usual howdy partner like in movies. In reality, settlers came from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Mexico, and China, bringing a unique culture and accent. The West was a patchwork of dialects, and at times, it was so different that they didn't even understand each other. Brothels and gambling dens. Back then, red light districts existed. But whenever we see movies from the past, we have this image that brothels and gambling dens exist everywhere. But that's not true. Most towns in the Wild West were family communities with schools and churches. The other things existed in temporary boomtowns, especially near mines or railroads. But even there, it was tightly controlled. Buffalo Bill was a true cowboy hero. We all know and love Bill Cody's shows. But the reality is, he is a genius marketer and not a hero. His Wild West show toured the world, mixing fiction with exaggerated stories. He also reenacted battles that never happened, portrayed Native Americans and villains, and ultimately made himself the star of every legend. In real life, Bill was an actor and a hero, creating the very myths that we're debunking today. The Wild West lasted for centuries. Most people imagine the Wild West spanning for centuries, but in reality, it barely lasted 3 decades, from the 1860s to the 1890s. Once railroads, telegraphs, and barbed wire arrived, the frontier was already over. Civilization came fast, and by the 1900s, the world's wild was gone. Native Americans were primitive. It couldn't be more false. Tribes like the Navajo, Cherokee, and Sioux, even though they were brutal when provoked, had complex systems of government, advanced agriculture, and complex architecture. The Pueblo people built the multi-story stone dwellings centuries before the Europeans ever arrived. Native medicines also incorporated natural antibiotics and herbs that modern science still studies today. Calling them primitive was a political move and far from the truth, only forming justified conquest and erasure. The Wild West was about freedom. And finally, we have the biggest myth of them all, that the Wild West was all about freedom. This is false. It was controlled by railroads, land barons, and corrupt officials. Racism, economic inequality, and violence were still common, especially for most of the native tribes and slaves. But within these hardships, there was a real story. This story was about people who dreamed of freedom and built it piece by piece, with grit and sacrifice. The real West wasn't wild. Rather, it was human. It was full of people chasing hope, risking everything, and surviving through grit. Which fact surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel if you want more videos like these.